the BeachSAMP Stakeholder Meeting, our first stakeholder meeting of 2017. We have been hard at work writing the BeachSAMP document for this year, which is why we haven't convened you guys in 2017. We should have a few more meetings in the coming months, but we want to welcome you to this first public stakeholder meeting of 2017. My name is Teresa Preen. I work here at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. I'm at the Coastal Resources Center and Rhode Island Sea Grant. And I serve as the URI project coordinator for the BeachSAMP effort in our relationship with the Rhode Island CRMC. So my task is really to manage the public process, kind of wrangle the researchers, and make sure that the liaison between the researchers at the university and the state agencies is solid and contributes to all of the work products that are coming out of the BeachSAMP project. So if you're new to the BeachSAMP project, we're going to jump right in tonight to the chapters, the first 3 chapters that we're releasing for the BeachSAMP project. But this project has been going on for 5 years. And we do have, if you check out our website, beachsamp.org, we have meeting videos of past meetings. We have all kinds of other resources and projects that have been going on at the local level for municipal resilience planning, for sea level rise, storm surge, coastal erosion. We have resources for businesses and also for coastal property owners. So we really encourage you guys to all check out the BeachSAMP website if you're just new to the project and the process, and to get sort of up to speed on where we've come in the last 5 years. It's really started before Superstorm, right before Superstorm Sandy, and after Superstorm Sandy, we were able to really advance a lot of the work for this project. I mentioned that we have past meeting videos on the website. So with that in mind, I wanted to let everybody know that we are live webcasting this meeting tonight. So we will be mic'd, and we do have a floating mic up here. When we open up the floor for Q&A or discussion, I will run around with the live microphone so we can get your questions on the webcast. If you don't want to be part of the webcast, you don't have to be. You're welcome to ask us questions after the meeting if you have other questions, or email us after the meeting. So before I introduce our stars tonight, our speakers, I do want to make 2 other announcements. This coming Saturday here at the Graduate School of Oceanography, we are hosting an open house. And I want to invite all of you and tell your friends to bring friends and family and kids. There will be a lot of activities here at the Graduate School of Oceanography. We're celebrating URI's 125th anniversary. And we'll have tours of the Endeavor, tours of our nuclear reactor that's here on campus, a lot of activities on the quad over here and down by the ship. So we encourage you guys to come from 10 to 4 this coming Saturday here on campus. And the other announcement I want to make is we have this as our public stakeholder meeting to introduce the BeachSAMP chapters, but we also decided to have a second stakeholder meeting in the month of October up in Barrington, because we haven't really had a lot of BeachSAMP outreach public meetings in the Upper Bay, in Upper Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island. So we decided to have a second meeting up in Barrington to just really bring the BeachSAMP up there, because this isn't just the BeachSAMP. We're not talking just about beaches, we're talking about shoreline change. So we want to make sure that our Metro Bay municipalities in the Upper Bay also have an opportunity. If they didn't want to cross bridges to come here tonight, and they're not able to check in on the webcast, we're going to bring the BeachSAMP and the Shoreline Change SAMP up to Barrington on October 26th from 6 to 8 p.m. in the library. So if you have people that you know in the Upper Bay who you think would be interested in learning more about the Shoreline Change SAMP, we encourage you guys to spread the word on that. And I'm happy to answer questions about that meeting after we break. So with that, I'm going to invite Robert Fugate to come up. He's the Executive Director of the Coastal Resources Management Council to introduce you to the Shoreline Change Special Area Management Plan.
Okay. Thank you, Teresa. So I hope all of you have had a good summer. It's been pretty quiet with the BeachSAMP, I know, from the stakeholder process relative to that, but I think you're going to see that we were fairly busy during that period of time trying to prepare for this. I think also with the storms that we're seeing down south and the hurricane season's not over yet, you can see that there's some relevance to the stuff that we're actually starting to deal with here. So getting into this, what you're going to see tonight here is that we're starting with chapters 3, 4, and 5. There may be some questions as to why aren't we starting with 1, 2, and 3. And we'll explain that as we go on, but there is a method to our madness, so to speak. The BeachSAMP, so we'll do a little bit of review here. The BeachSAMP is actually a guidance document. So it's written so that it can be updated regularly. The science is changing very rapidly. Our understanding of things is changing very rapidly. And so are the adaptation tools that are starting to be developed, changing very rapidly. In order for us to be able to modify this document and keep it relevant, the guidance approach allows us to do that. So that's why this is being done that way. There will be regulatory changes that will also occur that will refer people to the guidance document. And I think as you see as we go on tonight, it will make a little more sense to you as you start to see this unfold. But there will be requirements, new permitting requirements, to essentially go through what we're sort of terming here a scenario-based analysis, which I think as we get into chapter 5 will make sense to you. So the point of the BeachSAMP has been, and we've been extremely busy over the last couple of years, trying to get an understanding of what our future is. The attempt of the BeachSAMP was to sort of take a long-range look, to step back, and take that long-range look to see what climate change is doing to our shoreline, what it might do to our shoreline, and then how do you adapt to those new conditions. We have been developing a number of new tools. One of the positive aspects, if you can call it a positive aspect, that came out of Sandy was there was a lot of influx of federal funding that came in associated with that. Things like the Army Corps' North Atlantic Comprehensive Study and modeling that came out of that provided us with tools. And we also got funding to develop new tools ourselves. So we have a capacity now in the state that is unmatched by any other state, and for the most part, most federal agencies don't even come close to matching the capacity that we have right now to look at these situations and see what can occur. So these tools have been developed all the way down to the property level scale, meaning that we need to be able to get down to individual property decisions so that people can make the best choices for themselves on these. And as we go through this, you're going to see that we're going to talk a lot about risk tonight and coastal risk. And that's both short-term and long-term. Short-term, we tend to think of coastal storms, so we can see potentially a hurricane or a nor'easter in our coastline, which would be a very short-term issue for us today. And we do talk about those types of events that can occur and decisions that have to be made. But we also then take a longer-term view and incorporate sea level rise into these, along with the storm considerations. And then that also triggers other synergistic effects, such as erosion and accelerated erosion that we're also looking at. So we're trying to bring in the latest data, the latest science. We're trying to educate people through these meetings and other venues that we have as to what we're actually working on, what the science is showing us. And then we're trying to develop these tools and best practices. And we're looking all across the nation, all across the world actually, to see what's out there and see what those best practices are that we can actually start to import here and bring in, as well as developing our own new tools. Throughout the process, we've had a series of guiding principles that have been sort of our cornerstone in developing this plan, and these are listed here. I'm not going to go through them all, but you can see that we are trying to bring in the best science in a very transparent manner and incorporate it in here. And the other thing that we're very concerned about is this issue of risk, identification of risk, letting people understand that risk, and allowing them to make these risk-based decisions so that they have no regrets within the framework itself. Since this project has been going, as I told you, the science is changing extremely rapidly on us. Actually, when we started out this process, We started out with an original incorporation within the coastal program of our forest state of an assumption of 3 to 5 feet that was built in back in about 2008. Since then, the science has been advancing, particularly in terms of the understanding of the ice sheets, both Greenland and Antarctic, and what they are delivering to us in terms of sea level rise. And since then, the 3 to 5, which we were told we were completely crazy when we came out with, and went to 6.6 as the high estimate for Newport. And that seemed very high to us till the new ones came out in January. And now the high estimate within the 83% confidence interval is about 10 feet. So it's going up, and there are some credible scientists that say this is still an underestimate, but we will have to wait and see. The program has adopted the NOAA estimates internally within it so that we use the NOAA science rather than trying to develop our own estimates. And they're based off the 2 tide gauge stations, the primary tide gauge stations at Newport and Providence. We had to choose a point because of this change in conditions, and the tool development is not cheap. We have sort of frozen it in time. We acknowledge that there is this 10-foot estimate out there, but we have frozen it in time right now, at least for the documents standpoint, to get it out the door at about 6.6 feet, or 7 feet in other words. This is showing the boundary of a 100-year return event, so a 1% storm, and 7 feet of sea level rise. Essentially, that blue boundary is the area that would be impacted by that. That was sort of our worst case scenario, and that's what the document has been bounded on for planning purposes, at least right now. As soon as the document is adopted, we're going to go back and make the changes necessary. Of course, we've already adopted within the program, because as I told you, we referenced the latest estimates from NOAA in terms of our sea level rise curves. That's already been adopted within the program itself, so we are at 10 feet within a program, but this document has been written for the 7-foot analysis. Within the document itself, and the program has been developing a series of tools. These are a listing of some of those tools. We have shoreline change mapping that is both based on historic and also projected erosion. We have storm tools, which we presented here in past stakeholder groups. We have the SLAM maps, which stands for the sea level rise affecting marsh, which is a model that allows us to project the changes in salt marsh as we go forward. And also another new tool that we're starting to roll out. We've done it for Charleston and Warwick so far, and we are now doing it for Barrington, Bristol, and Warren, and also westerly South Kingstown and Narragansett. And that is called the Coastal Environmental Risk Index, which is a tool that sort of combines all the risk into one weighting system that allows us to look at the relative risk to the area from the natural factors that are present and that we're seeing. The document itself is going to be carved up into 2 volumes. The first volume is probably what most people will pick up. It is just the guidance document itself. However, there is a volume 2, which will contain all the technical papers and research that's in behind it that will show how we arrived at the assumptions and the answers that we've come up with at this point. The rest of the document looks like this. It's an introduction. Chapter 2, the reason we have waited on this one is because the science is changing so rapidly. We wanted to make sure we captured the latest science as the document went out the door in terms of climate change, sea level rise estimates, and those types of things. 3 we're going to present, 4 we're going to present, and 5 we're going to present tonight. And then there's a 6th one that's under development right now, which is the state agency guidance document and municipality guidance. And then lastly, Again, this is one of the last documents to be developed because of the changing conditions associated with this, but we're going to attempt to bring in and show some of the adaptation techniques that can be used, as well as sort of a resource guide for people that want to dive in deeper into that. Some of the sources of information that they can look into to do that. One of the groups that's offered to help us with this is FM Global. They are an insurance company whose business model is based on essentially looking at risk associated with commercial clients and then providing mitigation measures that might be appropriate for those clients to secure their facilities and protect them from those risks. So it's very consistent with what we're looking at here, and they have offered to help us in that regard. So tonight, as I said, we're going to do chapters 3, 4, and 5. Tiffany's going to come up here actually in a second to take a deeper dive into both of these 3 and 4, and then I will end off the night with chapter 5, which is the permitting section for the council. And again, what we're targeting for January, February of 18 is a revisit of the introduction that's been done. Chapter 2 is the science that's sort of going behind this, and then we're going to be following up with Chapter 7. We're looking at an adoption sometime late in the winter, early spring, for this document to be adopted by the council, and then almost immediately we're going to have to go back in and change a lot of this to keep up with some of the newer science. And we will also, we're in the process of having budget discussions right now with the budget office on how to keep these tools current so that they remain viable and useful to us in the future. We've already developed, for instance, a 10 and 12 foot layer to help us understand that, but some of the other tools will need to go back and adjust it. So we're already in discussions with the budget office to make sure we have that capability. And I think I'm at the end of my whatever here. One last thing I'd like to mention is that, in fact, there's another workshop that's being held tonight. There's a resiliency roundtable that's being held tonight, and there is a new chief resiliency officer for the state that is housed within the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. We are working closely with him, and he is obviously taking a lot of what the BeachSAMP is already starting to develop to bring into his resiliency efforts. So there will be a dovetailing and bringing these efforts together so we are seamless at the end of this as we go forward. So all that information is being brought in to our, we're both accommodating each other in this effort. Let me put it down.
Don't go anywhere yet. Any clarification questions for what Grover's presented so far? Yes.
When are you planning on working with FM Global? Do you have a plan for that?
Yeah, we are looking at working with, we've already been meeting with FM Global in a number of topic areas. We have been in discussions with their engineering group in particular, and they are waiting for us to draft up Chapter 7, which we are anticipating sometime in the early part of 18. And then we would turn it over to FM Global for them to provide additional advice to us how to better adapt to some of these situations. There's a lot of things that are out there that can be used that can reduce people's risk. They may not get credit for it on their flood insurance program and those types of things, but it will help reduce the risk and prevent flooding or other damage done from wind or those types of things to their structures. So we're trying to get that information out for those people to make those adaptations. Unfortunately, a lot of stuff that we see that is out there to move the flood insurance needle this very major stuff, we believe that there's a lot of small stuff that can be done in between that that will be very helpful to people to reduce the risk. So,
Okay, thank you. Let's move on. I wanted just to, before we get into the discussion of the individual chapters and introduce Tiffany, wanted to let you know that as of a half an hour before the meeting started, the website went live with all of the links to the chapters. We have found it pretty effective to review the chapters verbally with an audience before we put the documents up for review. So hopefully we'll give you a nice comprehensive overview of each chapter tonight, and you can go home and have some fun with downloading these chapters and having some nighttime reading for the next few weeks. So this is what the page looks like. Everything that's highlighted in blue allows you to download the document and also connect to an online comment form. But you are also welcome, and we invite you to, if you want to write a letter or submit some other document, typed up document, online. We do really want to encourage people to provide comments electronically to us, and we're going to be cataloging these into a master spreadsheet so that we have a record of all comments. But we've given you an opportunity to use an online form, or you can upload your own document. So this website is now, a web page on the BeachSAMP website is now live. So when you go home tonight, you should be able to access those. And we are setting a comment deadline of 30 days from tonight. So comments are due by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, November 13th. So we're giving you that last weekend to get your final comments in before November 13th. Yep.
so we're better sip some, Mike, I guess.
Okay. Thank you.
We're running this process very similar to the way that we did the Ocean SAMP. So you, the stakeholder group, get the first crack at these chapters. Based on the information then and the comments that we receive, we'll go back and have a look at the chapters and see if we need to make adjustments, further refinements, those types of things. Ultimately, when we've gotten all the input from you, we make whatever changes, then we bring it to our council. We have two council members here tonight. We have Don Gomez and Patricia Reynolds. Are you guys, can you raise your hands? Okay. They will then take the document and have a look at it. Once it gets into their hands, there will be another opportunity to comment. There will probably be workshops before we actually go to any formal hearing before the council with this. But there will be other opportunities to comment and have input into this. We want to make sure that you guys have ample opportunity to review this, to comment, and if necessary, comment again on the document as we go forward. Like the Ocean SAMP, it improves with your input. We took our best shot at it. Now you guys have a look at it and give us what you think of it, and we'll go through that and have a look to see where we can actually improve this document. So, thank you.
Okay, great. And so on your agendas, I also just want to point out that the BeachSAMP website link is at the bottom of your agenda, so please take a copy of this home. And there is also a web link in here where you can access the online documents for download and the comment forms. Okay, so with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Tiffany Smythe, who has been our primary author of chapters 3 and 4, and she'll start off by talking about assessing coastal risk in Rhode Island. Tiffany. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. How are you tonight? Thanks for coming out for this really important topic. I'm, if you don't mind, going to stand out here. I don't do podiums. I'm too short for them. I'm here tonight to give you a very short overview of a couple of fairly complex chapters, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. I'm going to present 3 first, field some questions, and then move on to 4. Teresa was kind to refer to me as the author. I'd like to think I was more a facilitator of these chapters because they represent contributions from a number of experts in this field here at URI, at CRMC, and other local institutions, some of whom are here tonight. So. All right, so Chapter 3 is assessing coastal hazard risk, and the idea for this chapter was really to introduce this concept and to explain why we think it's important and how we're approaching it. So we sought to answer some pretty basic questions. What is coastal hazard risk? How is CRMC approaching it? And why is CRMC doing this? And I want to emphasize here that we're talking about the concept of coastal hazard risk, not the specific hazards. The BeachSAMP does address 3 specific coastal hazards in depth. Those are storm surge, sea level rise, and coastal erosion. You'll hear a lot about those tonight, and then you'll learn a lot more about them from a scientific standpoint once we do Chapter 2, which will come later, as we mentioned. This chapter is meant to provide context for Chapter 4, which is an examination of the exposure of Rhode Island resources to these hazards, and then Chapter 5, which Grover will introduce. Here is an overview of what this chapter entails. There are really 2 sections. One that provides this overview of assessing coastal hazard risk and resilience, again, introducing some broad concepts. And then the second is explaining some of the tools that are available to assess coastal risk in Rhode Island. And we'll be zeroing in on just a couple of those sections tonight just to give you a flavor for what's in this chapter. So the first question that we tackle in this chapter is why? Why are we focusing on coastal hazard risk? Why does CRMC think that you should plan for coastal hazard risk? And so to do this, we first share some of the numbers, some of the statistics on the effects of recent coastal hazard events on Rhode Island and other parts of the nation. One example, for example, is in Rhode Island, FEMA has declared 22 major disaster or emergency declarations since 1953. Importantly, the majority of those are in relatively recent years. Another set of statistics that we're interested in are effects on different entities like small businesses. So for example, we know that small businesses are particularly vulnerable to these kinds of hazards, and an estimated 40% of them close following a major storm event. It just gives you a flavor of some of the kinds of information in that section of the chapter. So continuing to address this question of why, we then go on to share some of what CRMC and the BeachSAMP team has learned through the process of developing this document, and then to explain, using some case study examples, what we mean by those lessons learned. So the lessons learned are: short-term coastal development decisions can lead to long-term management problems and investment commitments. Coastal development decisions can result in the unintended consequence of increased community exposure. Property owners and decision makers may not be aware of the residual risk that remains in the coastal zone despite existing programs and management measures, and so on. I won't read the rest out loud. For each of those lessons, what we do is we introduce a short case study in sort of a narrative style to explain with an example what we mean by this. All of these examples are either national examples or they're from locations elsewhere in the country, not from Rhode Island. But to provide a sense with concrete examples of what we mean by these lessons. For example, item number 1, the short-term coastal development decisions. There we talk about an example of a longshore coastal road being redeveloped and how that creates an economic commitment for a community that may be hard for it to bear over time. Okay. So then we provide a little bit of information on the institutional context for coastal hazard risk. This is a very short treatment of what could be a very, very long and tedious bit of your nighttime reading. We briefly explain CRMC's role with regard to coastal hazard risk, and then briefly acknowledge the jurisdiction and responsibilities of key other federal, state, and local agencies and entities, and then we refer you to where you can find all the information you would like about that topic. I should mention excuse me. I should mention that we treat CRMC's role here only very briefly because Chapter 5, the permitting chapter, is really where we go into that in depth. So this is just meant to paint that broader picture for you. Then we get into some of the key components of coastal hazard risk and try to explain some of these terms and concepts that you might find are used constantly in settings like this, but you might wonder what we're talking about. So here, for example, we identify a series of key terms used in this dialogue, one of which is coastal risk, and provide pretty simple definitions and then refer folks to where you can read quite a lot more about these concepts. So I won't get into all the definitions here, but there is a nice bit of information on those. Next, what we do is we provide an overview of the coastal risk assessment and management process. And really what we're trying to do here is point out that risk assessment and management, it's a process. It's not a one-off activity. You don't check a box and go home and be done with it. And this general discussion provides context for Chapter 5, which you will see has a series of steps that it brings property owners through in terms of assessing their own coastal hazard risk. Additionally, these steps, what we do in this section is explain this overall process and how different elements of the BeachSAMP, different chapters and tools, help property owners, decision makers to undertake this process. So in broad strokes, the general stages of this kind of a process are, at first, you identify your sources of risk and scenarios for planning purposes. We're going to come back to scenarios in a moment. The second is that then you assess your risk. Then you choose your measures of adaptation. You then implement said measures and monitor and evaluate. Very simple, right? We're all done. What I'd like to do here is explain what we do in the chapter is we explain the 3 different scenarios that the BeachSAMP lays out to help folks think about and plan for their coastal risk. And so the first scenario that we've referred to is a present day scenario, which is based on current conditions and a 100-year return period storm surge. And this image, which is pulled from a map from Storm Tools, which is a tool that we use extensively throughout the BeachSAMP. This image shows Roger Williams State Park in those conditions, with the orange referring to depth of water, and there are some sections here where you see in the picture where the orange represents approximately 7 feet of water. The second scenario we offer is what we call the mid-century planning scenario. This is based on a 3-foot sea level rise plus a 100-year storm surge. The idea is that this, and I should actually point out that these scenarios are all based on that NOAA 2012 high curve. That's the first curve that Grover showed you, with a maximum sea level rise in 2100 of 7 feet. So that's the more modest scenario that he showed you before. So what we think about from that scenario is that this represents conditions in 2065. But another way to think about this is that this could represent conditions earlier, like in 2035, with a 1-foot sea level rise plus an additional 2 feet of water depth based on either an extreme high tide or a wind-driven event that could elevate water depth further. And the third scenario here is the long-range planning scenario. This is what Grover referred to earlier as our worst-case scenario for the BeachSAMP. This is 7 feet of sea level rise plus a 100-year storm surge, or conditions in 2100, okay? And what we're doing in the BeachSAMP is recommending for the midterm, this one right here, for the mid-century planning scenario, that this is a good one for property owners to use when thinking about an individual property, whereas the long-range planning scenario is really important for decision makers making long-term investment or capital decisions. So what we do here is we just simply explain and lay out these scenarios with these graphics to illustrate them so that folks can then refer back to them through the rest of the document. Okay? All right, the final part of Chapter 3 is where we then introduce tools to assess coastal risk in Rhode Island. And if you've been coming to BeachSAMP stakeholder meetings in the past, or if you've been on beachsamp.org, you've seen a lot of this stuff already. What we do in this chapter here is we first explain that there are existing regulatory tools. Those include FEMA's flood insurance rate maps and CRMC's existing shoreline change maps that really refer to historic shoreline change. Those are existing regulatory products. But then the shoreline change SAMP process has resulted in a whole bunch of new tools for you. And these are planning tools, not regulatory. Okay, these include storm tools and several related products like SIRI, which Grover mentioned before. This includes the SLAM study, which Grover mentioned before. And in this section of the chapter, what we do is simply briefly explain each of these tools, direct the reader to places where they can go to learn how to use that tool or to find more background information about the science supporting that tool. Sure, these are just meant to be illustrations. This is the Newport waterfront here. And these scenarios were all Roger Wheeler State Park. Okay, So the last section of this discussion of tools here then briefly points out that there are other regional coastal mapping services available. There's a lot of them out there. Many of you who have poked around in this world will be familiar with them. We briefly identify a couple that are relevant to Rhode Island, and then we provide a chart that explains the differences between storm tools, which is our BeachSAMP tool, and many of these others, because it can be confusing. So that tool, that table will be a useful reference for you. One other table that we include in this section of the document that I think is really helpful is an explanation of what different scenarios storm tools provides you for planning purposes. So this figure is from the chapter, and as you can see, it points out the different sea level rise scenarios that storm tools addresses, as well as the different return period storm scenarios. Okay? So with that, again, this was supposed to be a very quick introduction to a chapter that you all are then going to go on and enjoy reading for your nightly reading. So I'd like to hear if there are any questions so far on chapter 3, and then we'll go on to chapter 4.
I will be the mic runner. Any questions? Peter?
Thank you. I hope these are appropriate at this point. First of all, I just want to clarify, we began saying this is coastal, but of course the events of sea level rise and storm surging also affects riverine areas. I assume you're limiting this in part because you've got limited jurisdiction. I'd appreciate it if Grover could clarify the jurisdiction. I know there are some studies underway on riverine. If you could just briefly explain how you're going to sort of sequence this to that, if at all.
Great question. We also, because of our expertise, we're asked to look at the Patuxent River, for example, and look at trying to develop a very similar tool as we do for the coastal areas, which we have done. That will ultimately, I believe, be on our website, at least for the Patuxent River. The funding streams that we have did not provide for us to go and do any other watersheds. But what we are looking at, which is of interest to us, is, and we've already started to do some work in what's called a coupling effect. So a coupling effect is when you've got a surge coming in, and as if we've seen in these hurricanes, particularly today, there are going to be massive amounts of rain in the watershed. So as that water is hitting the watershed and the surge is coming up, we can have those two events combined that will push the floodplain well beyond what we know today. And so we are looking at modeling that and trying to figure out what the risk is from those two events. Combining, we're also looking at sea level rise and how they would affect setting up a new tide stage, for instance, on the Patuxent, and how that would affect the precipitation event in the river. Again, it expands the floodplain beyond what we know today. We're also looking at things that FEMA doesn't look at, such as debris blocking up into the river and how that spreads the floodplain beyond what we are today. The unfortunate thing I think that most people don't understand is that a lot of the regulatory programs are built on statistical models and certain risk assumptions. And they don't take, in many cases, a conservative approach. FEMA, for instance, takes something just above the mean. And we're seeing that play out, particularly in the hurricanes that we're seeing today, where we're getting very large flooding events. Most of the, over 75% of the people in Houston that have been flooded do not have flood insurance. A lot of that is due to the fact that they didn't understand there's still risk within the system, that FEMA takes a not very good statistical approach, in our opinion at least, to dealing with those events. So what we're trying to do is provide people with the tools, the best science that we believe is out there, and showing where we believe those floodplains are, but also understanding that there's still a residual risk beyond that. So it's a matter of how much risk are you willing to tolerate. We're trying to give people the tools to adapt to the situations based on the risk that they're willing to assume.
Great. Thank you, Grover. Other questions on Chapter 3? Burning questions. We'll have time at the end to address more questions about all the chapters? Anything burning right now? Okay, great. So I'm going to invite Tiffany to move over to Chapter 4. I'll change the slide. So I don't cough for the next presentation.
Okay, so Chapter 4, we're going to spend a little bit more time on this one because this is a much more complex chapter with a great deal more data in it. And I should say that it's really, that being said, it's really not possible to meaningfully summarize each and every section of this chapter because it's so complex. So we're going to touch on a couple of points, but this is one that I do encourage you go and read carefully and spend some time with. Thank you. Because I will forget that, so thank you. Okay, so our goal with Chapter 4 was to provide an overview of what is known to date about the exposure of Rhode Island's coast to coastal hazards associated with climate change. And the coastal hazards, and we mentioned this before, but we're really focused primarily on 3 in the BeachSAMP document, and those are storm surge, coastal erosion, and sea level rise. So what is this term exposure? What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about people, property, systems, natural resources, infrastructure, and other elements potentially affected by a hazard, okay? And this question is actually going to respond to Peter's question earlier, but partly which was about jurisdiction, I think. So we make this very clear at the beginning of this document to explain the scope and why we're talking about some things more than others. And so we are focused within CRMC's jurisdiction, as well as within our planning boundary, which we introduced earlier, which is that area that extends inland from the mean high water line to the inland extent of the 7-foot sea level rise plus 100-year storm surge boundary. And I'll show you that map again to make that clear. Additionally, you will see a pretty frequent focus throughout this chapter on those planning scenarios, and in particular on that long-range planning scenario, that idea of 7 feet of sea level rise plus 100-year storm surge, in other words, what we're calling conditions in 2100. And here is that shoreline change SAMP planning boundary once again to remind you of the jurisdictional focus here. And so another way to think about what we're doing in this chapter is that we sought to answer a series of questions. With regard to the natural environment, we wanted to know, what do we know about the exposure of coastal habitats under CRMC's jurisdiction? With regard to the built environment, we wanted to know, what do we know about Rhode Island's coastal communities, the 21 communities, to these hazards? And then, and this is an especially important one I want to emphasize because we would really love to hear comments on this, then we talked a lot about research needs. What future research is needed for both the natural and the built environment with regard to these issues. Okay, this chapter includes all sorts of different sources of information, and wanted to give you a general idea of how we approached these different sources. So a lot of the sources of information are from Shoreline Change SAMP data or studies or tools, and those include things like storm tools and the sea level affecting marsh model report, which you see up here. We also have historic as well as projected future shoreline change studies that were done in connection with Shoreline Change SAMP, and that's included here. And then there's something called a CRMC statewide exposure assessment, which will make more sense shortly. This is one that many of you will have seen presented at an earlier BeachSAMP meeting. So those are new CRMC or URI studies or data that were used in the chapter. But there's a lot of other stuff going on too in this area, and what we tried to also then draw upon were existing data and studies performed by other teams of scientists or performed by other agencies. So, for example, with regard to our section on coastal wetlands, we drew pretty heavily on some science performed by other folks here in the state. We also briefly mentioned a variety of these other state agency assessments of different issue areas, different kinds of infrastructure with regard to these coastal hazards. Now, one of the challenges we had here is that all of these different studies use different sea level rise scenarios, different assumptions. Some of them look at sea level rise but not storm surge. Some of them look at storm surge but not sea level rise. So it can be very difficult to compare one to the next and to assess their relative value, their strengths and weaknesses. So what we try to do with regard to both our own studies and others that we used was to make assumptions very clear, just to state up front what sea level rise scenario was used, what storm surge scenario, so that you could then evaluate that information accordingly. We stopped short of comparing them in detail and assessing strengths and weaknesses because of the complexity associated with comparing apples and oranges. So the chapter here involves sections on the natural environment, erosion, the built environment, a synthesis of exposure to the different coastal hazards that we're looking at, a section on the synergistic effects of those hazards, and then a section on ongoing future research and analysis. Today we're really going to focus just on a few of those sections here, just to give you a bit more of a flavor for the kind of content that's in the document. And that'll be, we'll focus on chapter highlights, natural environment, built environment, and ongoing and future research. Chapter highlights. So this is a section that came about out of all of us sitting there poring through all of these data and trying to make sense out of what was important and meaningful out of all of this wealth of information. So it is something like an executive summary, but it's meant to even be a little simpler than that, where we draw out what we believe are the most important or interesting data points or findings from all of the different sections of the chapter, and we bring them forward and present them so that you can read them all in one place. An example is, from one of the sections, a BeachSAMP analysis which found that Matunic and Misquamicut, as well as Barrington, Warren, and Bristol, are particularly exposed to the combined effects of storm surge, sea level rise, and coastal erosion. That is based on the at-risk area reports that we include in the synthesis section of this chapter. A second example is a key finding from the built environment section of this chapter, which is based on CRMC's statewide assessment, exposure assessment. And this is a finding that over 27,000 residential structures, 11.5% of Rhode Island's coastal communities, are exposed to the combined effects of sea level rise and coastal erosion sea level rise and storm surge under that long-range planning scenario. And those are examples, and there's lots more in the document for you. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So the natural environment section really focuses on three pieces. It focuses on beaches, barriers, and headlands. It focuses on coastal wetlands, and then on other coastal habitats. There is a wealth of information, especially in the beaches, barriers, and headlands information. We do a lot of work to characterize the physical processes of the coastline of that region, and then provide information on things like the impacts that shoreline protection structures have on those physical processes. More information than is practical to summarize tonight, so I hope that you will read that in depth. To give you a flavor for what kind of content is in that section, this is some key data points here. For example, we cite studies that point out that the Rhode Island South Coast is largely erosional. South Shore barriers have an averaged annualized rate of shoreline change of almost 2 feet per year. Stratified headlands have a rate of about 2.5 feet per year. And the highest rate of change that's been observed is along the Matunic headlands, where total erosion since 1951 approached 300 feet. These findings here are really pretty much based on Brian Oakley's work assessing shoreline change on the South Coast. There's a great deal of it in the document. It's very interesting. And this figure illustrates those the differences in erosion in those different stretches of the shoreline there. And another figure from this section on physical processes on the beaches, barriers, and headlands. We include at least one map from a shoreline change analysis that shows that Matunic area, which has experienced such dramatic erosion. And so you can see here, actually this doesn't These lines that you see here represent different mapped shorelines. So the red one is the 1939 shoreline, and the blue is 2014. So that provides you a quick visual, without even getting into this in depth, of how much erosion that area has experienced. Okay. So then we have a section on coastal wetlands. And we talk at great depth in this section. We incorporate some work done by Save the Bay scientists working with the NERS program, as well as the SLAM study that CRMC did. And these are just some sample findings based on those two studies. These studies tell us that Rhode Island is likely to face a substantial loss of coastal wetlands to sea level rise under a range of different scenarios. South coast marshes are generally more vulnerable to sea level rise than those up Narragansett Bay, although there is some variation within that. And this was really interesting coming out of some of that scientific work. Low marsh elevation above mean high water and presence of tall Spartina alterniflora are indications of vulnerability. So to keep the slide simple, we did not include all of the citations from all of that work. I encourage you to please go read that section. There's some very interesting science there. And this figure illustrates the point about the vulnerability associated with median marsh elevation above mean high water. The green dots represent high elevation, and the red represent low elevation. And you can see them concentrated on the south coast there. Okay, so that was, again, just to give you a flavor for some of the kinds of content in that natural environment section. So the built environment section. What we incorporate in this section is largely a lot of findings from the CRMC statewide exposure assessment, which I'll remind you a little bit more about shortly. And then we also bring in a series of other state assessments which deal with different specific issues like critical infrastructure, wastewater, transportation, and so on. We're going to focus tonight on some findings from that statewide exposure assessment because we devote a good deal of attention to that in the document, and that was an area where CRMC focused its effort in terms of this issue in the Shoreline Change SAMP. So some of you will have seen this study presented at a BeachSAMP meeting last year by Nicole Leparacci. It's a study that looked at Rhode Island's 21 coastal communities and used the state E911 data set as well as storm tools maps. And it looked at the exposure of residential, commercial, and public service structures in those communities based on those scenarios. The full sets of raw data and a presentation highlighting the study are all available on the BeachSAMP document. You can download Excel spreadsheets. You can do as much with this as you'd like. But what I'm going to try to do here is just quickly point out some of the data that we pulled into the SAMP document, which is only a portion of the data that was actually created through this initiative. What we did in the document is we pulled in data from a variety of different scenarios. I mentioned earlier that we have these 3 focal scenarios that we use in the document. They are that present-day planning scenario, the 100-year storm surge, the mid-century, the 3-foot plus 100-year, and then the long-range, 7-foot plus 100-year. So data based on those 3 scenarios are pulled into the document, as well as a few others so that you can compare effects of sea level rise and storm surge at a range of different scenarios. This is a map generated through that study that shows the density of affected structures in 2100 under that 7-foot sea level rise plus 100-year storm surge scenario. And so looking at this map, the colors represent different densities of inundated structures. The red illustrates the highest density, greater than 1,000 structures per square mile. So quickly you can get a visual feel for areas of the state that are expected to be more exposed under this long-range planning scenario. We can see an unfortunately large blob, a few of them up the bay there, particularly in the Barrington, Bristol, and Warren area. So there are a lot of summary data from the study in the document. Just a couple of key findings to share with you tonight. I mentioned one earlier. Under this scenario, there are about 27,000 residential structures in the 21 coastal communities that are exposed under that long-range planning scenario. And if we look by percentage, the most exposed community is Barrington, with 64% of its structures exposed. For commercial structures, about 3,000 or 19% are exposed in the 21 coastal communities in total. And again, going by percentage, the most exposed is Barrington, with about 71% of commercial structures exposed. And finally, looking at public service structures, and that's things like police stations, fire, things like that. We found that 566, or roughly 14%, of those structures are exposed in the 21 coastal communities. And the most exposed community by percentage is Warren, with 55% of those. And again, these are all based on that long-range planning scenario, 7 feet of sea level rise, 100-year storm surge. If you are intrigued by these data points, there are many more in the document for your reading pleasure. Okay. So to bring this to a close, the last section of this document, and as I mentioned before, we want your comments on the whole document. We're especially interested to hear what you're going to tell us about this section of the document. Because here we talk about ongoing and future research and analysis. And what we do is we acknowledge studies that we are aware of that will be relevant to this topic and should be incorporated once they're done. I'm sure there are ones we don't know about that we should be mentioning in here. We then identify future research needs for both the built and the natural environment. What we've included in here so far are those that have come up through our own writing process, but there will be others that we've not thought of, so please do offer us those suggestions. One example of those future research needs is, as Grover mentioned, as soon as we have adopted the document, we need to go back and update these assessments with NOAA's 2017 sea level rise projections to bring all those scenarios up to the best available data. Again, with that, I'm going to pause here and take questions. I just want to re-emphasize that there's a lot of dense information in this chapter. The goal here was simply to provide that real broad brush overview to give you a feel for it so that you can go and read in depth. But with that being said, look forward to hearing what you think. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. Any questions on Chapter 4 for Tiffany? All right, Peter's, I'm going to start over here first, Peter, if that's okay. Here you go, sir.
Regarding storm surge, what would you consider to be an average storm surge, either in feet or percentage above, say you say you've got a 7-foot sea level rise, what would you expect the average storm surge to be? Your guess is as good as anybody else's.
Thank you.
Again, a very good question. The surge elevations will vary along the shoreline in the state. For example, in the South Shore, we see surge plus waves being a very damaging and dominant feature within the South Shore area. As we transition up the bay, because of the configuration of the bay being sort of like a delta shape or diamond shape, it causes an amplification of the surge to occur as that surge goes up the bay. So if it starts at, say, 17 at the base of the bay, it could be 19 feet by the time it gets up to the top of the bay. The other thing that is important for us, and we try to get into a little of this into the document itself, is that storm tracks mean a lot to us. It's why we don't use slosh models and we don't use Cat 3s or Cat 2s, because we could find a Category 2 storm being more damaging than a Category 3 depending on the track of that storm. So it really depends on the track, it depends on the category of the storm, it depends on the position of the bay. There's no real figure that I could give you that's an average storm effect. The other thing that we found, and this goes back to why you're seeing some of the tools we're developing, such as the suggested design elevations, is that when we looked at FEMA's analysis and FEMA's mapping of the bay and our South Shore, particularly on the South Shore, there were some serious defects in their studies. We can go into that at some point, but there is points along the South Shore where they underestimated the storm surge by 6 to 10 feet. That is another factor that gets brought in, whether we're using the FEMA maps or our own suggested design elevations based on the mapping and modeling that we've done. So, I wish I could give you a better answer, but it's a complicated issue.
What you can do, what anyone can do if you'd like, is go to Storm Tools and look up your own address or an address, a place that you're familiar with, and you can get a feel for actual water depth of that actual place under the different storm surge and sea level rise scenarios. And I should acknowledge that Malcolm Spalding is here, who was instrumental in the development of Storm Tools and these chapters.
And I would just add to that, too, with storm tools, when we talk about the 100-year return period storm, the comparison that we've been drawing for public outreach purposes is the 1954 Hurricane Carol water level. So we have historical photos on record, and those water levels have matched up pretty well with Hurricane Carol. So just to give you a mental image and a picture of what that might look like. It could be a little misleading to think about the 100-year return period storm, but the Hurricane Carol images kind of help drive it home. Peter. Excuse me. Thank you.
Thank you. You've mentioned three factors that you took into consideration in doing these projections. One is storm surge, second is erosion, and the third is sea level rise. But what about rainfall? And I'm thinking of it in two terms. First of all, the gradual increase that we've seen in the state of rain levels, which can lead to more saturation of the soil. And second, I think what you were getting to, Grover, is what Al Gore calls these rain bombs. You know, the hurricanes now carrying more water because the temperatures are warmer and hanging around longer. Is there some, I assume you haven't been able to factor that in yet to what may happen in these different communities, but is there some effort underway to get a grip on that?
Major concern in the state is wind. Both of those are very damaging factors that need to be taken account for. We have, through the university and through Malcolm's efforts, developed the capacity to look at both of those issues, and we can do that statewide, but we take additional funding to do that. But we have developed the ability and the tools to do that. It's just a matter of funding to actually go at it.
I think it's sort of naive of you to ignore the 38 hurricane. Some of us lived through that, and have vivid memories.
No, you're absolutely correct. We don't ignore the 38 hurricane. It's just that when you look at where you classify that on a recurrence level, the 38 falls between like a 200 or 250-year storm. Most of the
we're living older.
Yeah, most of the regulatory programs, I'll get into this here in a little bit in Chapter 5, but most of the regulatory programs drive off that 100-year event. That's why we referenced the 1954. The 1938 was an extremely damaging event, much more than the 38. The 54, and we know that. We don't ignore it. It's just that the recurrence level of that storm is a little bit further out than most regulatory programs use for.
Is that to be the worst case scenario?
38, unfortunately, is not our worst case scenario.
I have a question or a comment. I think we tend to look at storm events as short-term events that we're going to get through and move on, whereas sea level rise is permanent and is incremental. And I would hope, I would think that the studies and the public outreach would start to show what will happen to areas such as Quonset or the beaches or the ports, regardless of storms. I think when we emphasize storm surge, we tend to make people think of it as transient and not something that they must deal with in land use planning and politics.
Thank you.
That's a very good point, because, and one of the things that's brought out in the document is the long-term effects of sea level rise will likely be greater in terms of its impact on the state and the coastal that storm-driven event that we will see. And as you pointed out, it will be permanent. There's a lot of information that's out there, but one of the other things that's out there is that if we look at the FEMA flood insurance program, for instance, it is a catastrophic, it wasn't designed as a catastrophic program. It uses historical data, so it's only looking backwards, it doesn't look forwards. And at some point, it's going to have to make an adjustment in terms of the rates that they're charging. In other words, they're not charging people enough for the flood insurance and the risk that they have. When that happens, it's going to start to precipitate some changes in the real estate market, and already Freddie Mac is predicting that there will be a downturn in the real estate market in coastal areas worse than the 2008 downturn that we saw, and it will be permanent because of the fact that it's sea level rise driven, not storm driven.
Thank you. Other questions on Chapter 4? Yes, sir.
To what extent of the coastal community administration integrated this in their planning?
To be fair to the coastal communities, this document is just coming out now. A lot of the studies are within the last couple of years. We are working with the cities and towns as you can see, we've already been working with, for instance, Charleston, Warwick. We're going to be working with Barrington, Bristol, and Warren, as well as Westerly, South Kingstown, and Narragansett, and looking at more detailed studies on these risks. We are trying to bring this into the municipal decision-making process. Chapter 6 is going to be focused on looking at some of that stuff and working with coastal communities to get them to understand. There's also been a series of training sessions that have been developed through the university to help board members, planning boards, zoning boards, start to understand and get them exposure to these tools so that they start to understand it. Let's recognize this. No state has done this analysis, not to the degree that we have. We are the first state to ever do this. The other thing is that in this process, worldwide, we are still fairly much in the nascent stage of understanding, trying to deal with this risk, and how do we go about dealing with it. People often cite the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is a totally different situation than what we have here. They are they're monolithic about that issue. There is no question. They just go at it. And they do it on a scale that's unheard of in this country. Unfortunately, most of the coastal municipalities, and the advantage that they have being in Rhode Island, is we're getting them tools that they couldn't afford to get otherwise. The storm tools that we just developed, for example, the city of Boston just paid one tool, $3 million, to develop something that is not even as sophisticated as what we have for all the municipalities. So those are we have the basis of information to start to get the communities here in Rhode Island the head start that no other communities really have in the United States at this point. So it's just starting. We're trying to figure this out. It's going to take us a while to dig our way out of this point. Let's be honest about it. We put ourselves here over a couple of hundred years. It's going to take us a little while to dig our way out.
I would just add to that, the state of Rhode Island passed in 2012 a Comprehensive Planning Act that did add a requirement for local comprehensive plans to include climate change and natural hazards into the body of the comprehensive plan, which is the blueprint for every municipality has to have one. And so a lot of the towns have updated their comprehensive plans to include this as a topic, but it does not go as far yet in terms of implementation and actions as CRMC has led with development of these tools and this policy. So there are different initiatives in play, and I think we're moving towards bringing them together so that everybody is using the same data. Great. Other questions? Yes.
Do you have any of that information on Narragansett Beach by any chance? On the beach in Narragansett, with how high the erosion's going to be or predicted to be? Because we're losing the beach now in a high tide, so I was wondering.
There are some, as you've seen, there are, for every inch of shoreline in Rhode Island, we've developed erosion maps based on historical erosion rates.
It's in there somewhere.
Yeah, what you're going to see in Chapter 5 is that we also are providing a tool, it's a multiplier that you can add onto the erosion rate that will start to project the erosion into the future. So it's a way of sort of adjusting the current erosion rate for the future conditions that are going forward. So, yeah.
What a perfect segue into Chapter 5. Thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you for your questions. We'll have some more time at the end for more questions. So with that, Grover, I invite you to go ahead and introduce Chapter 5.
So, thanks. I'm just going to get past these again. One state that has started to look at this, and one of the things that I just want to point out that is, again, an understanding that you have to take is that every regulatory program today, everyone, is developed under the assumption that nothing changes in the future. And that's okay if we were willing to say, we're going to tear down everything every 5 years and rebuild it again. We know that doesn't happen. We know that we build for, in most cases, 50 years or longer. But the assumptions which you are told to build at do not account for those changing conditions. That's what Chapter 5 is designed to overcome. We are trying to get people to anticipate using the best available information we have today with conservative assumptions, meaning that we are going beyond the mean. We're using the upper 95% confidence interval. And for those who aren't well-grounded in statistics, what that means, we're 95% sure, for instance, that flooding levels will not exceed what we're showing on our map. We're building that so that you will have the information to build not to today's conditions, but future conditions. And that's what Chapter 5 is designed to do. California started to do some of this, but they've only looked at sea level rise. They haven't looked at coastal storms, they haven't looked at erosion, they haven't looked at anything else. They took a very simplified look, and they are asking people to accommodate this within their plans themselves. So part of what we've tried to do is take, again, something along those same lines as California's already doing. And by the way, Rhode Island and California are the two states that are way out in front of them on this one. But what we're looking at is a sort of stepwise process for you to go through and will become part of the application process for new or substantially altered structures within our jurisdiction. The other thing I want to point out is that by using the planning boundary that we have, the information that we've developed, it goes well beyond our jurisdiction. So if municipalities want to replicate it, we built the framework for them. We're providing the tools that they can follow essentially the same process that we're doing, follow that, and go forward with it. So, start out with step one. Step one, we're asking people to choose a design life for your structure. How long do you want that thing to last? And then based off that design life, what we can do in step two is we can start to give you, based on the site conditions, some scenarios and information that will help you look at these conditions. And we're suggesting for residential structures that they use a minimum of a 30-year design life, obviously for mortgage purposes, but you're not required to do that. The one thing that I want to point out is that this is really a risk assessment process that's being built into the permitting process. We will still have our standard permit process, but what we're doing now is providing information to people to make a risk assessment on these decisions, and then to give them the information on the basis of the whatever risk they want to assume to build to a future condition, not to today's. For large-scale projects, these are projects that we typically see that are subdivisions or large lots with abilities to be moved around on the lot. And what we're saying here is that there's an opportunity to look at these sites and look at these SLAM maps, these marsh migration maps, and accommodate the marsh migration onto those lots by moving the building around or reconfiguring the subdivision layout. And so we're asking those to look at those and incorporate that within their planning. Ultimately, they will be taking and putting this with the design elevation here. The design elevation is a set of maps that will come up with a new floodplain estimate in terms of where you should actually be using the latest science, not using the FEMA assumptions that we do, but this is based on the latest science, based on the latest modeling efforts that we can do to estimate our flood risk and give you a much better number to plan for dealing with flood risk. Also, what you will be doing is taking that other site information in terms of erosion, sea level rise, and surge, which is being developed here through the design elevations, and incorporating that in a design. And then what we're asking people to do is show us how they're accommodating that on their lot. Are they using elevation? Are they using setbacks? Are they using other methods to adapt and deal with these situations? Ultimately, they will come up with a plan to submit as part of their application package, and that will be submitted to us. Our staff will verify, based on the design length that you've chosen, that you've made the right assumptions in your analysis, meaning that the data that you have used is correct. We will build that within our staff reports, and that will become part of the permit. So it's a sort of stepwise fashion, but it's being driven by the entity who's building it. The nice thing, though, is because it's incorporated within the permit, it also allows subsequent buyers, for example, to understand the risk that was assumed by the first person and see whether there have been developments that may either change that or that they want to add in to adapt to those situations and provide for a greater level of service life to those facilities. This is really an attempt to change people's thought process. Many times we go into a situation and we just think, and we look at the shore, and the shore is incredibly beautiful here in Rhode Island, and we get taken in by that beauty and we just want to be as close as we can to get to it. What we're trying to say is that is a risky decision. And you need to think about that. And you may still want to build as close as you can, and some people do have the money to do that. For those that don't, we're trying to give you the information so that you can build to that future condition. By the time you get to your mortgage period, you still have a house that's there and marketable, and you can go forward from there. So this is really it's a transformational process in how we look at development and how we move forward in this state. Any questions?
There's a couple more slides, but
Do you have any?
thank you.
Do you have any discussion in that part about recommendations of not building, rebuilding, of those kinds of sensitive subjects?
We have within the suggested adaptation measures, one of the things that, let me start by saying that a lot of the developers and people that we deal with on the shoreline have an incredible amount of money, and these are their second, third, and fourth homes. And they are willing to do whatever it takes to be next to the ocean. And when you run into those situations, there's not much you can do given the fact that we have our 5th and 14th Amendment in the Constitutions that we do. What we can do and what we are concerned about is not so much that front row of people, but it's the second, third, and fourth people that don't understand the risks that they have right now, and trying to build more resilient communities for the flood enclave. We do make suggestions that perhaps in those areas that where the design life doesn't meet the site life, that you may want to design that building to be able to move it at a later point. or that you know, we're already finding people that are using storm tools because it's embedded within our program already, that are using that to make purchase decisions based not only on the site itself, but the access points into those sites too. Because that's another thing we encourage people to look at, is your site may be fine, but the road you wanted to get into there no longer exists into the future. And so those are things that people have to be thinking about. There's a lot of other things that we touch upon in terms of the future research needs, but it's stuff that we need to look at. Groundwater, for instance, right now, from everything that we can see, and if we use the Cape as an analog, is rising at the same rate as sea level rise. And groundwater is pushing that bulge, the sea level is pushing that bulge up and will shorten the life, for instance, of septic systems as a result of that. It also shortens the life of pavement within these areas because roads are designed to get water off of them going down, not having it come up. And there's been some mapping exercises and some predictions, for instance, already done in the University of New Hampshire did for New Hampshire itself and Great Bay. And what they found is there are certain conditions where they will reduce for instance, the pavement design life by almost 90% due to the groundwater systems. TF Green has a direct hydrologic connection with Greenwich Bay. So these are things that we need to start thinking about and dealing with. There's a lot that we haven't been able to deal with in the plan that we really would like to get a handle on. But climate change is going to throw a lot of curves at us as we go forward, and we're going to have to be adaptable to those situations. One of the things that we encourage within the program, particularly for municipalities, is if you shorten the design life, if you, rather than building once and done, we're out of here for 100 years, maybe you want to think about shortening that design life and building something that lasts for 20 or 30 years, which gives you a chance to reevaluate whether that's an appropriate location at that point in time for those. I think, for instance, what we're seeing is many of the sewage treatment plants in this state face a very uncertain future. And they may have to find other locations than what they're currently located at today. So those are some of the things that the tools that we're providing are starting to help municipalities look at and starting to think about. If you want to build a school and you want to keep it out of a floodplain so you can use it as a shelter later on, you now have the tool to do that. So there's a lot of information there, but it's meant to think about those future conditions. And I can't overemphasize that enough. Our world is changing, as I just told you. The sea level rise estimates just within the span of this study have changed dramatically. Our world is changing very rapidly, and we need to think about what we need to design for, not today, but for tomorrow.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
To me, hi, Grover. I'm of the group that is interested in very much trying to protect our constitutional right to use the shore. I've spoken before. I was playing with storm tools over the last couple of days, and as I looked at one Rhode Island beach to the next, and I looked at the projections 5-7 feet ahead, beaches are, by their nature, at sea level. And now that we're talking about these types of increases over a short period, I'm now using a phrase, in your grandchildren, for my case, or for you young people, in your children's life. It's no longer multiple generations. Children born today will see the sea 10 feet higher than it is today. Narragansett, Wheeler, Scarborough, none of them will exist. The sea will have risen up to be across private property boundary lines. It may be premature to be asking it, but how do we approach that, and what does Rhode Island do when there's no place to go? No one can come here and get to a beach. Those beaches won't exist.
One of the points I often totally awfully pessimistic for a lot of situations. The 10-foot, we have the opportunity to alter that trajectory. We will still see sea level rise, and it will occur what we're seeing right now. But we have the ability today to adjust that trajectory if we want to. The 10-foot sea level rise assumption is built upon business as usual and us going forward as if nothing is occurring. But we do have the ability to deal with it. The public access in this area, I was just reviewing the document today, again, it came out of California, and it came out of a series of legal institutions that were there. Trying to look at tools like the public trust doctrine, and how do we use the public trust doctrine to protect and adjust to climate change. These are things that we're going to have to look at. As I said, this information is just coming out within the last couple of years in Rhode Island. We've given Rhode Island a glimpse into its future that no other state has. It's going to be a learning process from this point forward. I don't have the answers for you, unfortunately. We have a lot to learn. We have a lot to try to develop. It also possesses an opportunity for us to innovate. I was just talking to somebody today from the Marine Trades Association who would like to start to look at floodproofing. Boat owners have a vested interest in keeping water out of their boats. They have a lot of knowledge about floodproofing, and this is something that they would start to like to look at in the upland areas. Can they take some of those techniques and adapt it to structures in the upland areas? I mean, so that's an example of the potential that we have to innovate and deal with these situations. It's not all necessarily illuminating and all the rest of it. It's coming at us, and we now have a glimpse of what's coming at us, and we have an opportunity to innovate and deal with that. And I think we are better apps than any other state in the nation.
Other questions? Yes. I'll go here and then here.
You were talking about the higher storm surge or water level rise in the upper bay, which obviously makes sense. In the upper bay, particularly on the western shore, it's largely industrial, oil tanks, etc. Are those cities and towns and our state listening to you and taking into consideration the new rules and regulations that they need to make, perhaps now, to get those places, to get those things all out of there?
I think the discussions are just starting to occur. Some of you may know Barnaby Evans, but Water Fire, I'm sure you all know. Barnaby's the sort of creative fellow that's behind it. And he's a very astute individual looking at situations, and he was looking at Providence and he was looking at Boston, and he quickly reached the conclusion that Boston's got a lot of exposure. They're very low-lying, they built on filled lands, they have an extreme amount of exposure for some very expensive real estate in that area. When we look at Providence's conditions are totally different. They're built on a sort of a valley system carved out by the glaciers. We pick up elevation very quickly along the sides of that, and our exposure is much more limited because we have this narrow entrance that we can deal with. And his point is that Providence could probably deal with this issue much easier, much quicker, and for a lot less money, and become a lot more attractive to businesses than Boston because of those situations. Those discussions are starting to occur now. People are actually talking about it. We're having discussions with the Army Corps. We have an individual from the Army Corps here tonight. Those are starting to happen. You're not going to see anything occur at lightning speed here. We are talking about government, but we're starting to make inroads in those areas, yes.
Thank you. Question here?
Yes. Is there going to be a cost associated with the to the applicants for having their plans reviewed by CRMC?
Just the standard application cost that we have today. There's no increase in that cost. Okay. We are trying to design the tool and provide an online platform that an average homeowner could go in and actually do this analysis themselves without engaging a professional. The fact of the matter is, though, that the class of development that we're talking about, and that's new or substantially altered structures, every one of those that comes into us has design professionals. And we're running training sessions for the design professionals to do this. This is not intended to be a high-cost item. It is more, where the cost, I think, will come in is the discussions that will occur with the homeowner on what the design options are to try to adapt to those future conditions. That's where the cost is likely to be.
Question over here?
Does anyone know what will happen in the real estate market when this gets published? In particular, are realtors going to be required to point out to potential buyers information on the property that's available in these studies?
Thank you.
Very good question. It's an interesting one because we've had erosion rates in our state for decades now, and posted and required as part of the program. Many states won't even undertake that type of analysis because they're afraid that it might impact the real estate market. Flood controls have an impact on the market. Storm pools is already embedded in the program. We've seen no change in market conditions. I think what you will see is, and ultimately, there will be an adjustment in the market itself to conditions if people don't adapt. We're seeing this in the Mid-Atlantic and starting to see it in places down south where once a neighborhood starts to see tidal inundation, these high tide events, sunny day high tide events, 2 to 3 times a month, the market value starts to bottom out on a lot of these homes. In addition, there have been studies to show that for every $500 you pay in flood insurance, takes about $10,000 off of the market value. That's because the assumption is you haven't built to a condition that will withstand those events. That's why flood insurance is going to be very, very expensive in the future for some people, because of they're being told to build at an elevation today that within their 30-year mortgage period they will be below base flood elevation, meaning that they will now start clocking those heavy rates. FEMA, as we've seen, is already starting to incur substantial debt if these storms continue into the near future. Congress is going to have no choice but to start to make FEMA more actuarial in terms of the way that they actually assess rates. And that's going to drive the insurance costs up again. But it affects the structures that have not been built to a proper standard. So we're giving you, I liken this to skeet shooting. So if you watch skeet shooters, they don't shoot at the target directly. They give it lead. They point the gun ahead of the target, so when the target arrives, they hit it. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give the homeowner the information so that when they arrive at that point in the future, they built to a condition that they will still have a marketable home. So I don't see this as necessarily causing an immediate adjustment to the market conditions. However, if we don't adjust, yes, we will see adjustments in the market and they will not be pretty. And we have to remember that communities, that's their tax base. Communities will start to lose tax base. In Rhode Island, we don't have too bad of a condition, really. When you go to places in New Jersey, there will be communities that will lose almost their entire tax base as a result of this. Those are the things that are really worrisome in the future, I think, for the nation. But we have an opportunity to get ahead of that.
I would just add that last year, the year before, we produced a coastal property guide that was distributed to the Rhode Island Association of Realtors, and I think there were several thousand copies of that distributed to realtors across the state. So the initial outreach has been done in the last couple of years, and how this will impact disclosures in the future, I think, is yet to be seen.
The other thing is that I think importantly to note is that guide was actually developed with the help of the realtors.
Question over here, Grover.
I have a three-pronged question. Number one, you mentioned a decrease in property values. Won't that really create a divergence within the state, some going up and some going down? The other question, you mentioned Boston being especially liable. Isn't Manhattan in worse shape?
Yes, what's often pointed out about Manhattan is because of the fact that it's one of the financial centers in the world, it will probably attract a lot of federal funding to defer some of the costs to adjust to the conditions that they have there. The sad fact is that the vast majority of municipalities in this country will probably receive zero.
Yeah.
Adjust to that.
Okay.
It'll be having to deal with it on the backs of their taxpayers.
My third one, both the governor and Stefan Pryor seem driven to bring finances and industry and business into the state. Has there been any offer to you to package your hard research into a functional program, clone you, market you, and sell you to 25 other states?
I know that Mountain Spalding sitting over here has thought about that question very hard. I think people are watching this very closely. Not this current administration, obviously, but the past administration did invite us to the White House because they were very interested in how far Rhode Island was ahead of the other states. I think the other states are waiting to see how we pan out. And yeah, there might be an opportunity to do that. The other thing I'll just point out is that the Infrastructure Bank just had a conference the other day, and what we're hearing is that already they're starting to integrate some of the information that we have for storm tools and looking at future business sites for bringing people in. So people get interested, big businesses get interested about the longevity of their sites and how they might be impacted by storms because they're interested about business continuity. So they're starting to, that information is starting to get into those types of discussions.
Thank you.
That's okay, I'll project. Could you just briefly summarize the timeline now after the 30-day comment period? What happens then? Thank you.
Thanks.
A lot of it is going to depend, obviously, on the number of comments that we receive and the extent of those comments. But we will be taking this back and assimilating them into looking at the chapters again. We will have to do a rewrite of those chapters, and then based on how we get those chapters out, I'm hoping that we can get them out sometime, I would say within the new year, start to get that into our council process, which will then allow us to go forward for the council to adopt the document formally. Because it's a guidance document, and this is not a reg change. We're not bound by the same requirements under the APA. We don't have to go through the same Office of Regulatory Reform process, and therefore we have an opportunity to move the document much quicker than we could otherwise. And also because we've done a guidance document that indicates the front part of this session tonight, we will be able to change that document much more rapidly to keep it up with the science authorities information.
So next year, would people have to follow those 5 steps?
We're anticipating by this summer that people will.
Summer of 18.
Yeah.
Hey there, Grover. My name is Bobby. I was wondering if in the second step of your assessment, when you're having like homeowners put their impacts to their homes or businesses from sea level rise, do you guys have include the exact or ask the homeowner to put the inundation that would impact their home, like maybe at 2 feet? My home would have the front step covered at 3 feet, my door would be covered or whatever. And if you don't, do you think it's possible to include that numeric value to maybe incorporate into hurricane models as they improve?
Yeah, what Storm Tools allows you to do is there's 2 components to Storm Tools. One allows you to look at the right down to the individual site basis. So the resolution of this on the ground is about a meter, and it's about 5 inches vertical. That's one of the things that separates us from everyone in the nation, is that nobody approaches the resolution that we do. That allows you to go in and look at a surge or seal rise scenario and where it impacts the site in terms of the extent of the site. There's another tool that allows you to go back and look at the elevation from both from NAV 88 and also from the surface elevation or mean high or high water mark, and look at how that water level falls on the lot. So based on the elevation of the home and that elevation, you can start to see how the home is impacted, both through surge and sea level rise events.
Do you want to talk about the Storm Tools design elevation at all?
Well, I don't know if Malcolm wants to explain it. Malcolm's better at it than I am.
Malcolm, would you like to explain Storm Tools design elevation?
Sorry, I'm putting my clean shirt on. So the idea behind Storm Tools design elevation maps is that it turns out that the FEMA firm maps are made for setting flood insurance rates. That's their sole purpose, according to FEMA. The unfortunate thing is that most states and most cities and towns use them for structures. So for the design of a structure or infrastructure, they look at the FEMA firms and they say, there you go, there's the numbers, right? Now, if you thought that climate wasn't changing and you had no sea level rise, and 30 years in the future, the sea level would be exactly where it is, and the storms would be exactly the same kind of storms, then at the end, they work perfectly fine. So historically, the FEMA firms, using them for the building codes, and they're embedded in the Rhode Island building code, and each of the towns essentially adopts those codes, right? And that's what's adopted nationally, too. If you believe sea level rise is going to be significant, you'd think the smart money is to separate what sets the insurance rates for the next year versus what sets the design for the next 30 years. Right? Makes sort of logical sense. Anyway, so what we're doing is we're going to, I am violently opposed to the FEMA firms. They have so many mistakes it takes your breath away, both here and in other places. I just served on a national panel reviewing the FEMA firms for New York City. I'm telling you, it took my breath away listening to them. When they did the analysis, they started the analysis in 2011. They issued the preliminary maps in 2013. The city challenged the maps. In the review process, we found out that the contractor didn't consider Sandy in the analysis. Yes, that's what I said. So what are you laughing about? I said, Sandy just occurred. It's the once in 250-year storm. It's had the largest impact on New York City since 1816, and you didn't consider it because your contract didn't say you had to. Anyway, Storm Tools design elevation maps are essentially to create base flood elevation maps that are comparable to the firms but have sea level rise in them. And so we've essentially completed those for Charlestown and Warwick. Those are done. We are going to be doing them for Barrington, Warren, and Bristol. Those are coming up. We've started on those. And then we will have them for all of the South County coastline in a year and a half.
Thank you, Malcolm. And so you can see that that's step 2B under step 2 for property owners to identify their Storm Tools design elevation. So that mapping tool will be completed hopefully at the same time, possibly in advance of this going through the CRMC approval process.
Don't need the mic, I don't think. I was at Storm Tools for Beginners when I was checking out the beaches and other things, and I also have Storm Tools Advanced, but I didn't think it was running correctly. It wasn't giving me the upper level sea level rise. Did I screw up, or is it not?
No. Do you want me to take that one? You take that one.
We have developed a 10 and 12 foot layers, but we haven't, because we didn't want to confuse people with this document coming out. We held those back until the document's adopted, and then we'll make those layers available.
I actually did add them to Storm Tools for Beginners for illustrating the risk at public events.
Maybe you should have taken the question.
Maybe I should have. We did put it out for public information, but again, as Grover said, for the BeachSAMP document, we're looking at that 7 foot throughout at this time.
I saw it on Storm Tools for Beginners had the higher levels, but I didn't see it on the advanced.
We have not updated the advanced yet. We're still, as we always present Storm Tools in the discussion, it is a work in progress. We're always getting feedback, so this is helpful to hear that you've been using it, and thank you for using it. So we're always looking to improve. There are a couple other things that are broken right now that we're trying to fix. So thank you. Other questions? Okay, any parting words, Grover?
No, as I said, I think the takeaway message tonight is that when we build hopefully to see these buildings last into the future. Unfortunately, because of the changing conditions that we have, we need to think about what those future conditions look like. And we need to start building for those. Not only new structures, but a lot of what we're building in process and working with other groups is also to go back and look at retrofit situations. So it doesn't necessarily take a new structure to become more resilient, but we are going to be providing tools and techniques to go back and retrofit structures to make them more capable of surviving these events or dealing with some of the sea level rise scenarios that we're seeing. So this is an opportunity for us, for Rhode Island, to get ahead of everybody else and make ourselves more resilient to these so we don't suffer what we see down south these days in terms of the complete destruction of the infrastructure and everything else. We can think about this and we can deal with it. We have the tools to do it.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Thank you, Grover. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Dr. Spalding. Again, comment deadline is November 13th, and we look forward to receiving your comments, and please enjoy reading our BeachSAMP document. Thank you.